On June 25, 2009, paramedics were called to a mansion in Los Angeles where Michael Jackson was found unconscious in his bedroom. He was later pronounced dead at the age of 50. According to official investigation findings and court testimony, the drug at the center of the case was Propofol, a powerful anesthetic normally used in operating rooms under strict medical supervision. But that day, it was not being administered in a hospital. It was being used inside a private home. During a period when Jackson was preparing for his comeback tour. At his side was his personal physician, Conrad Murray. What began as treatment for chronic insomnia became the focus of a criminal investigation, and later, a landmark manslaughter trial. Because somewhere in that bedroom, between dependency, pressure, and medical responsibility, the boundary between care and negligence began to blur. At that time, Michael Jackson was preparing for a 50-show comeback residency in London known as This Is It, a project that had been widely reported in the press as a defining moment in his final career chapter. Court testimony and investigative reporting later described a man under extreme pressure, not just from performance expectations, but from the financial weight of mounting debt and the responsibility of delivering one of the most ambitious concert runs of his life. Insiders and public records from that period consistently described chronic insomnia as one of his most persistent struggles. Nights without sleep were followed by days of rehearsal, where he was expected to perform at a level that had defined his entire identity since childhood. From a psychological standpoint, this period is often framed as the collapse of invincibility. A man who had been shaped by fame from an early age, trained to achieve perfection, and separated for decades from a normal private life, now faced the reality that his body could no longer easily obey the demands of his legacy. The pressure was no longer just artistic. It was physical. It was emotional. And it was increasingly tied to the need for medical intervention to simply rest. Because when a performer's identity is built on flawless execution, even sleep becomes something that must be controlled. And that raises a deeper question. What happens when a global icon reaches a point where even the people around him stop believing he can slow down or say no to him? At that stage in the timeline, Conrad Murray entered the private world of Michael Jackson not through a hospital system, but through a personal employment arrangement. According to court records and testimony presented during the trial, Murray was hired as Jackson's personal physician during preparations for the This Is It concert series in 2009. Public reporting and financial evidence discussed in court described a monthly payment arrangement reported to be around $150,000, a figure that immediately reshaped the nature of the relationship between doctor and patient. Because this was no longer a standard clinical environment. It was private. It was constant. And it was financially binding. Investigators and prosecutors later argued that Murray was facing significant financial pressure and debt at the time he accepted the role. While he maintained he was acting in a medical capacity, the structure of the arrangement placed him in a position where his primary source of income was now tied directly to one patient. And that patient was not an ordinary case. He was one of the most recognizable figures in global entertainment history. From a psychological perspective, this is where the concept of financial codependency becomes central. When a caregiver's financial survival becomes linked to a single client, the natural boundaries of professional judgment can begin to weaken under pressure. The role of physician, which is normally governed by strict institutional oversight, begins to shift into something more personal, more isolated, and far less regulated. In traditional medical settings, treatments involving powerful anesthetics such as Propofol are administered only in controlled environments, typically operating rooms or intensive care units, where monitoring equipment, trained staff, and emergency protocols are always present. But in this case, as described in trial testimony and investigative reporting, the care environment had moved into a private residence. A bedroom. A space without the safeguards of a hospital system. And that shift is critical to understanding how boundaries began to blur. Because when medical practice is removed from its institutional structure, decisions become more dependent on individual judgment rather than protocol. And individual judgment, under pressure, is where ethical lines are most vulnerable. Over time, according to arguments presented in court, the relationship evolved into a dependency loop. One person struggling with chronic insomnia and intense performance pressure, and another person increasingly responsible for managing the condition in isolation, outside the normal boundaries of regulated medicine. At this point in the story, the key question is no longer just what was prescribed, but how far professional responsibility can stretch before it begins to fracture. Because when a doctor's financial stability depends on a single patient's continued trust, and a patient's ability to function depends on that doctor's continued compliance, the system itself begins to shift. And that is where prosecutors later argued the danger began to grow. At this point in the investigation and testimony surrounding Michael Jackson and Conrad Murray, attention shifted to a single substance that would later become central to the entire case: Propofol. A powerful intravenous anesthetic designed for one purpose only: to induce unconsciousness in controlled surgical environments. According to court testimony, Jackson reportedly referred to it as milk because of its appearance, a detail that later became symbolic of how normal something so dangerous had begun to feel inside his private environment. But Propofol was never intended to exist outside a hospital setting. In standard medical practice, its use requires continuous monitoring, oxygen support systems, and trained personnel ready to respond instantly to any complication. Yet according to evidence and expert testimony presented during the trial, those safeguards were not consistently present inside the Carrollwood residence. Instead, treatment was moved into a private bedroom, away from the controlled conditions where the drug was meant to be administered. From a psychological perspective, this is where the illusion of control begins to take shape. Because what starts as a solution to a problem, insomnia, can gradually transform into a system where the risk is rationalized, and the boundary between medical necessity and dependency becomes harder to define. Night after night, the pattern reportedly repeated. Late hours, escalating fatigue, increasing reliance on sedation, and a growing belief that sleep could only be achieved through intervention rather than natural rest. Timeline reconstructions presented during the case describe a narrowing window of time, where each night carried the same urgency. 1 o'clock in the morning, 3 o'clock, sometimes stretching into the early hours of dawn. And within that cycle, two opposing pressures were building. On one side, a performer desperate for rest, facing the demands of an international comeback that required physical perfection. On the other, a physician operating in an isolated environment, managing a level of responsibility that would normally be distributed across an entire medical team. And according to the psychological interpretation presented by prosecutors and experts, this is where dependency deepened on both sides. Because Jackson feared what would happen if he stayed awake, if he could not meet the demands of rehearsal and performance. And Murray feared what would happen if he failed to meet the expectations of the men he was treating, in an environment with no institutional backup. In that space, control becomes an illusion. Not because either person stops making choices, but because each choice becomes constrained by the pressure of the next night. And as that cycle repeated, the line between treatment and dependency reportedly became increasingly difficult to distinguish. By the final hours of June 25, 2009, the sequence of events involving Michael Jackson and Conrad Murray began to tighten into a critical timeline that would later be reconstructed through testimony, phone records, and emergency reports. According to evidence presented in court, the night followed a familiar pattern that had reportedly developed during the weeks leading up to that day. Late hours, sleep attempts, medical intervention, and escalating urgency. At some point during the early morning hours, investigators and prosecutors argued that a final dose of medication was administered in an effort to help Jackson sleep. Shortly after, the situation began to change. What had been framed as a treatment for chronic insomnia turned into a medical emergency. Court records and witness testimony later described a moment where Jackson became unresponsive. From that point onward, the timeline became fragmented and critical. Emergency protocols were initiated, but the sequence and timing of those actions would later become a major focus of the investigation. According to prosecution arguments, there were delays in calling emergency services, and inconsistencies in how life-saving measures were performed. CPR, as presented in testimony, was reportedly attempted in a non-clinical setting, without the standard equipment or surface conditions typically required for effective resuscitation. Monitoring devices that would normally track vital signs were not functioning or were absent from the immediate bedside environment. And as minutes passed, the situation moved beyond treatment into crisis response. When emergency services were finally contacted, dispatch audio and call records entered the public record, marking the official transition from private care to public emergency intervention. From a psychological perspective, this moment is often described as the enabler's dilemma. Because by this point, the roles inside the room had already shifted. A doctor who was supposed to maintain clinical control was now reacting under pressure. And a patient who had relied on that medical authority was no longer able to respond. But the most difficult question raised in later analysis was not just what happened in those final minutes. It was how a system built on dependency, trust, and isolation reached a point where standard safeguards had already broken down before the emergency even began. Investigators would later argue that this was the moment where control fully collapsed. Not in a single action, but through a series of decisions that left no safe option available anymore. Following the events of June 25, 2009, the case involving Michael Jackson and Conrad Murray moved from a private medical tragedy into one of the most closely watched criminal trials in modern celebrity history. In the courtroom, the narrative fractured into competing versions of the same night. The prosecution argued that Murray acted with gross negligence, claiming that powerful anesthetic medication was administered outside of accepted medical standards, and that basic safeguards required for patient safety were not properly in place. They presented expert testimony describing how Propofol is only intended for controlled hospital environments, where continuous monitoring and emergency response systems are immediately available. The defense, however, presented a different interpretation. They argued that Michael Jackson himself had played a role in self-administering the fatal dose, framing the situation as a case of patient-driven dependency that exceeded the physician's control. Within this conflict, the courtroom became less about a single moment in time, and more about competing psychological narratives. Responsibility versus influence. Control versus dependency. Professional duty versus emotional pressure. Witness testimony and medical experts introduced the idea that the environment inside the Carrollwood residence had blurred the traditional boundaries between patient and physician. What should have been a structured medical relationship governed by institutional oversight had, according to both sides of the argument, evolved into something far more unstable. A private system of care operating without the safeguards that normally define medical practice. From a psychological standpoint, this is where the concept often referred to as the God complex entered the discussion. Not in the sense of literal divinity, but in the perception that extraordinary fame or authority can distort boundaries of risk, responsibility, and consequence. The courtroom debate ultimately centered on a difficult question: whether Conrad Murray was a negligent caregiver who failed to uphold medical standards, or a physician caught inside a dynamic where the expectations of a global superstar made refusal feel impossible. And beneath all the legal arguments, one unresolved tension remained at the center of the case. Could any doctor realistically maintain control in an environment where the patient's demands, fame, and dependence had already reshaped the rules of care? After the trial arguments surrounding Michael Jackson and Conrad Murray, the focus of public discussion gradually shifted away from the courtroom, and toward something deeper. Not just what happened in the final hours, but how a life like this reaches that point in the first place. Because long before the medical events of 2009, there was a pattern that shaped the entire trajectory of Jackson's life. Fame that began in childhood. A career built under constant global observation. And a world that rarely allowed him to exist without attention, expectation, or projection. From archival footage and historical reporting, one of the most consistent themes in his life was separation from normal social development. While millions saw the stage performances, the awards, and the public image, far less visible was the increasing distance between him and ordinary environments where honesty is unfiltered. Over time, fame does not just create admiration. It creates structure. And within that structure, accountability becomes increasingly distorted. Surroundings begin to adapt to the individual rather than challenge them. Employees become protectors of the system. Criticism becomes filtered. And honest feedback becomes rare, because access and stability depend on maintaining approval. This is where psychological experts often describe what is known as fame-induced isolation. Not physical isolation in the traditional sense, but emotional and relational isolation. A condition where a person can be surrounded by people at all times, yet still lack unfiltered truth. In Jackson's case, public record and biographical accounts consistently describe a life where trust became increasingly difficult to navigate, and where personal space was heavily controlled by the demands of global fame. Over time, this environment can create a dependency structure of its own. Not only on substances or medical care, but on the presence of people who sustain the environment itself.
Yes.
A system where yes becomes the default language, and no becomes increasingly rare. From a psychological standpoint, this is where distortion begins. Because when a world is built around protecting a person from discomfort, it can also unintentionally protect them from reality.
Did he ever beat you?
And that is where the most dangerous form of isolation develops.
Yes. What did
Not when someone is alone, but when they are constantly surrounded, yet no longer grounded by honest contradiction. The more powerful Michael Jackson became in the eyes of the world,
I used to not look at myself.
the more difficult it may have been for people around him to challenge him directly. And in that environment, even medical relationships can begin to shift under the weight of expectation. Not because one moment changes everything, but because thousands of small moments gradually remove the boundaries that once made clarity possible.
The way you dress, the way you look.
After weeks of testimony in the case involving Michael Jackson and Conrad Murray, the jury reached a final verdict. Conrad Murray was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The court concluded that his actions fell below the standard of medical care required in that situation, and that his conduct played a direct role in the events leading to Jackson's death. He was later sentenced to 4 years in prison, along with the loss of his medical license.
He's never heard me say this.
Outside the courtroom, reactions were immediate and deeply divided.
I don't want him to be called
Fans
Michael
gathered in
Jackson.
grief,
That's
struggling
not
to
nice.
process the loss of an artist
They
whose
call the father
influence had
that.
shaped
That isn't
generations.
nice.
Media outlets
Bleaching
around the
your
world
skin
replayed
and
the same
have
questions
art-
again
is your
and
skin
again,
lighter
searching
because
for
you don't
clarity
like
in a
being
case that
black?
had become
Number
both
one,
legal judgment and
there,
cultural
as I
trauma.
know of, there is no
Inside
such
the
thing
courtroom,
as
however,
skin
the
bleaching.
legal
I
process
have a
had
skin
reached its
disorder
conclusion.
that destroys
But psychologically,
the
the
pigmentation
questions
of the
remained
skin. It's
unresolved.
something that I cannot help.
Because while the
Okay,
verdict
but
assigned criminal
when people make up
responsibility to
stories that I
Conrad
don't
Murray,
wanna be who
it
I
did
am,
not
that's
fully
fine.
answer the deeper structural question behind the tragedy. Was
Was
this solely the failure of
concert.
one
I
physician?
approve of something, yes.
Or
But
was
you
it the
can't
outcome of a much
always
larger
control
system
the press.
built
You
around the
can't
pressures,
approve of everything.
expectations,
You can't
and
invite
isolation
them
of
in
global
again and
celebrity?
again, and then at a
From
certain
a
point,
psychological
close them out.
perspective, the case continued to raise concerns about how dependency can form in environments where boundaries are weakened over time,
Wonderful again. I'm really
where
happy.
professional roles become personal
Really makes
relationships,
me-
where pressure replaces protocol,
I don't
and
know
where
if this is
isolation
anything,
quietly
but I know
replaces
Dick Clark-
accountability.
Okay, thank you very much.
In that context, the concept of the enabler becomes more complex than a single individual. It becomes a pattern of gradual compromise. A series of decisions made under pressure. Each one small on its own, but together capable of reshaping outcomes in irreversible ways. And that is why, even after the sentencing, the public conversation did not fully end. Because the most uncomfortable part of the story was not just what happened in the final hours, but how many systems had to fail quietly in order for that moment to occur at all. In the final reflection on the case of Michael Jackson and Conrad Murray, the story does not end with a verdict or a sentence. It ends with an absence. An empty stage where rehearsals once filled the air. A flickering spotlight that fades without an audience. And a life that, for decades, existed in front of millions, yet increasingly behind layers of protection, expectation, and isolation. Because while the world saw a global icon, the reality inside his private world was shaped by fewer and fewer voices willing to challenge him directly. Not out of malice, but out of dependence, proximity, and pressure. In that final moment, the only consistent presence was a medical one. And that presence, according to court findings, became part of a chain of decisions that led to irreversible consequences. Conrad Murray was held legally responsible for his role in the events of that day. But the deeper psychological question remained beyond the courtroom. How does someone so visible to the world become so isolated in the moments that matter most? The answer, as explored throughout this case, does not sit in a single decision or a single individual. It sits in a system built around fame. A system where access replaces honesty. Where dependence replaces boundaries. And where the people closest to power may slowly become unable to challenge it. In that system, even medical care can lose its structure. Even trust can become blurred. And even well-intentioned roles can shift under the weight of expectation. In the end, the tragedy is not defined only by what happened inside that room, but by everything that made that room feel like the only option left. And that is why this case continues to echo beyond the courtroom. Because the final question it leaves behind is not just about responsibility, but about what happens when a human life is surrounded by millions of voices, yet no longer grounded by a single honest one willing to say no. Was Conrad Murray a criminal enabler, or a man overwhelmed by celebrity power? Comment psychology below if you want more true crime psychological case studies from Dark Case Files. And if this story shocked you, subscribe for more deep documentaries where we uncover the human psychology behind real crimes.